Good evening. We're settling into a remote monastery nestled high in the mountains, where ancient stone walls hold the quiet of centuries. Here, in the stillness of night, a solitary bellkeeper tends to the great bronze bell in the tower above, a guardian of time and silence. Let yourself drift into this timeless place, where the only measure of hours is the patient turning of stars. If this peaceful sanctuary calls to you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these quiet moments to your evenings. Cold stone breathes with the first glow of day. The monastery sits wrapped in mountain mist, ancient walls rising from layers of gray and pearl. Moisture gathers on granite surfaces, darkening the weathered faces where centuries of wind have carved shallow channels. Pale light begins its slow climb over distant ridges, touching the highest pinnacle of the bell tower first. A faint blush of gold against cool shadow. Mist drifts through the courtyard below, moving like slow water between archways and over cobblestones worn smooth by time. The air holds a crystalline stillness, cold and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth from the forested slopes beyond. Narrow windows puncture the thick monastery walls, dark openings that frame nothing but shadow, and the occasional glimmer of a candle burning somewhere deep within. The bell tower stands sentinel above it all, its bronze occupant, silent, waiting. Light spreads gradually, illuminating the rope that descends from the tower's heights. Its thick weave of hemp and fiber hanging in a long line through the vertical shaft. Wooden pulleys creak softly in the morning temperature shift, old timber adjusting to the changing air. Dust motes drift through slanted beams wherever dawn finds a gap in stone, turning the atmosphere golden and visible, each particle suspended in perfect slowness. The bell itself remains untouched, its surface catching the first true rays, bronze warming from black to amber. The mountain stillness holds. Stone corridors echo nothing yet, their length empty and expectant. Outside, the mist begins its slow retreat down the valley, revealing more of the monastery's foundation. The terraced gardens, the worn steps ascending to the main gate. Dawn has arrived, patient and complete, and the bell waits in its ancient place, ready for the day's first call. The mist shifts in gentle currents along the foundation stones, pooling in the courtyard, where worn flagstones drink the night's moisture. Moss-covered edges glisten faintly as the gray light strengthens, revealing the textures of centuries pressed into mortar and granite. A stillness settles over the mountain slopes, broken only by the distant murmur of wind through high pines. Higher above, the bell tower emerges from the thinning vapor, its slate roof dark against the pale sky. The bronze bell hangs silent within the shadowed chamber, its surface dulled by time and weather. Rope coils resting undisturbed on the wooden platform below. Through narrow lancet windows, the first hesitant rays of daylight slice through dust motes suspended in the cold air, painting thin lines across the interior stone. The monastery walls rise steep and unbroken, Their rough-hewn blocks softened by lichen and the slow erosion of mountain winters. Somewhere beneath the eaves, a trickle of condensation drips from a gutter onto the cobbles, each drop measuring the quiet advance of morning. The air carries the scent of damp earth and old timber, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the bronze above. Light continues its patient climb, warming the edges of the arched doorways and tracing the carved lintels that frame each entrance. The mountain's breath moves through the open corridors, a chill draft that stirs nothing but itself, leaving the monastery wrapped in its ancient rhythm of stone and silence and the slow turning of day. The mist thickens where stone meets mountain air. Moisture gathers in the carved grooves of ancient masonry, darkening the mortar between each block. Above, the bell tower rises through layers of cloud, its peaked roof barely visible against the lightning sky. The copper weather vane catches the first pale gleam, a single point of reflection in the gray expanse. Dawn seeps slowly across the courtyard flagstones, revealing patterns of moss in the cracks. The well sits silent in the center, its wooden bucket motionless on the rope. Water within reflects nothing yet but shadow. Along the eastern wall, narrow windows begin to glow faintly from within, holding the remnants of candle flames lit before dawn. The glass is old, uneven, casting no clear image. The tower door stands ajar, revealing the base of a spiral stair. Stone steps curve upward into darkness, worn smooth at their centers by centuries of passage. A draft moves through the opening, carrying the scent of cold rock and timber. Somewhere high above, the great bronze bell waits in stillness, suspended by thick ropes and iron fittings blackened with age. The ropes are hemp, pale against the dark wood of the pulley frame. Morning light climbs the outer wall inch by inch, illuminating lichen and the weathered edges of each stone. The mist begins to thin at the edges, drifting away toward the valley below. The monastery breathes with the mountain, patient and enduring, as the day slowly awakens around it. The mist shifts gently against ancient stone, drifting through the courtyard in slow waves. Moisture clings to every surface, beating on the cold granite walls, gathering in the crevices where mortar has worn smooth over countless seasons. The bell tower rises into the pale gray sky, its upper levels barely visible through the shroud of mountain fog. Somewhere far below, water drips steadily from the eaves, a quiet rhythm that marks the stillness before dawn. The first hint of light touches the highest point of the tower, a faint glow that barely distinguishes itself from the surrounding mist. The weathered bronze bell hangs silent in its chamber, framed by narrow arched windows that have watched over the valley for generations. Thick ropes coil beside the wooden pulley mechanism, their fibers darkened with age and use. The stone floor beneath shows the wear of time, grooves traced where the bell rope has swayed through decades of ritual. As the light grows, the mist begins to thin along the eastern wall, revealing the texture of individual stones fitted together by long-forgotten hands. Frost sparkles in the shadows where the sun has not yet reached, tiny crystals clinging to the lichen that grows in patches across the lower walls. The air remains still, heavy with cold moisture, carrying the faint scent of stone and mountain pine. A narrow window casts a pale beam across the interior corridor, illuminating motes of dust suspended in perfect stillness. The bell tower stands patient against the brightening sky. The bronze surface of the bell catches the growing light, reflecting a soft gleam across the weathered metal. Everything waits in the cold morning air, the monastery settling into the threshold between night and day, between silence and the first sound that will break it. The eastern sky holds a faint promise of light, though darkness still clings to the valley floor. Mist moves slowly across the courtyard stones, pooling in the worn hollows near the chapel door. The cold settles deep into every surface, a quiet weight that belongs to the hours before dawn. Far below, the forest remains invisible, swallowed by layers of gray vapor that shift without sound. A narrow window high in the tower catches the first pale glow. The light is tentative, barely enough to trace the outline of the bronze bell hanging in shadow above. Frost clings to the iron brackets and the rough grain of the wooden beams, each surface etched in silver. The ropes hang motionless, their fibers stiff with cold, descending into the stairwell where darkness still holds. Outside, the mist begins to thin near the roofline, revealing the texture of old slate and the patient curve of stone arches. The monastery walls emerge slowly from the gray, their surfaces damp and dark with the night's condensation. Lichen traces ancient patterns along the mortar, soft greens and ochres muted in the pre-dawn gloom. Stone steps leading to the tower entrance gleam faintly where moisture has gathered in each slight depression, marking the path worn smooth by centuries. The air smells of wet stone and mountain cedar, clean and sharp, carrying no sound but the occasional drip of water from the eaves. Light spreads across the eastern face of the tower, turning the pale stone from gray to a soft amber. The bell remains in shadow still, patient in its cradle of oak and iron. Morning has come to the threshold, and the monastery waits, silent and still, as it has waited through countless dawns before. The first pale wash of daylight spreads across the courtyard flagstones, touching the edges of puddles left from night rain. Mist drifts in slow currents along the base of the walls, thinning where dawn's glow begins to warm the ancient stone. The air holds a crystalline stillness, cold and clear, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and lichen from the surrounding peaks. High above, the bell tower emerges from retreating shadows, its weathered timber beams catching the rose-gold light. The bronze bell hangs motionless in its frame, surface dark and smooth, etched with age. The supporting ropes rest against worn pulley wheels, fibers barely visible in the growing illumination. Through the narrow tower openings, the sky brightens from deep violet to softer periwinkle, each moment bringing sharper definition to the mountaintops beyond. Inside the corridors, slanted beams of sunlight begin to pierce the tall windows, cutting through lingering darkness in golden shafts. Dust motes hang suspended in the light, drifting without haste, The stone floor beneath shows centuries of wear, smooth depressions tracing pathways toward the tower stairs. Carved archways frame the passage ahead, each one leading deeper into the monastery's quiet heart, where shadows still pool in alcoves and doorways untouched by the advancing dawn. Morning settles gently over the mountain monastery, the mist continuing its slow retreat down the slopes. The cold stone walls hold their breath, waiting in the stillness as daylight claims the heights and the bell tower stands silent against the brightening sky. Each footstep echoes softly against ancient walls. The spiral staircase begins its ascent from the lower corridor, curving upward into shadow. Stone steps, worn smooth by centuries of passage, dip slightly in their centers, where countless journeys have left their mark. The walls press close on either side, cool and damp to the touch, their surface rough with age. A faint smell of old stone and mountain air lingers in the narrow space. Pale morning light filters down from somewhere high above. Barely reaching these lower turns, the stairway climbs steadily, winding around and around, each revolution lifting higher into the tower's heart. The passage grows narrower as the stairs spiral upward. Small indentations in the wall, carved long ago to hold oil lamps, punctuate the ascent at irregular intervals. Some still bear dark stains from lamp smoke, ghostly traces of light that once guided the way. The air cools further, carrying the crisp bite of altitude. Tiny cracks spider across the mortar between stones, testament to winter frosts and summer heat. Season after season, dust motes drift lazily through the thin beams that slip through arrow-slit windows, too narrow to offer any view, but wide enough to admit the mountain dawn. The stairs continue their patient climb, each step a meditation in stone. Higher still, the stairwell opens slightly where an old wooden door stands, closed against a storage alcove. The timber is dark with age, its iron hinges crusted with rust that has frozen them in place. Beyond, the stairs resume their spiral, the rhythm unchanging, predictable as prayer. The stone here feels different, perhaps older, the blocks larger and more weathered. Threads of moisture trace delicate paths down the wall, where condensation forms in the cold hours before dawn. The sound of breathing stone, of settling mortar, whispers in the confined space. Above, the faintest suggestion of change in the air hints at the bell chamber drawing near. The final curve of the spiral brings the stairway to a small landing. Here, the ceiling rises, opening into the tower's upper chamber. The light grows stronger, streaming through larger openings cut into the stone. A wooden threshold, worn smooth and pale, marks the transition from stairwell to bell chamber. The air here moves differently, touched by mountain winds that find their way through the open arches above. The journey upward completes itself in this quiet threshold, where stone steps give way to the sacred space of the bell. The spiral continues upward, each stone step worn smooth in its center by centuries of passage. Pale morning light filters through a narrow slit window, casting a thin beam across the curved wall. Tiny particles of dust drift slowly through the illuminated air. Suspended and unhurried, the limestone surfaces glow soft amber where the light touches, while deeper shadows pool in the outer curve of the stairwell. Higher now. The passage narrows further, the walls closing in as the tower tapers. Cold air descends from above, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of old bronze and weathered rope. Another window appears, this one facing east, where the morning mist clings to distant peaks. The stone here is darker, stained by moisture that seeps through ancient mortar. Small patches of pale lichen cling to the inner wall, their delicate patterns undisturbed. The stairs begin to level as the ascent nears its end. Overhead, heavy wooden beams cross the passage, their surfaces darkened by age and cold mountain air. The sound of wind becomes clearer now, a low whisper that moves through unseen gaps in the stonework. A final turn reveals the threshold to the bell chamber, where broader daylight waits beyond the narrow climb. The air here is thinner, cooler, touched by the open sky that surrounds the tower's peak. The ascent is complete. Stone gives way to timber framework, and the sheltered stairwell opens into the chamber where the great bell rests in silence. Dawn light fills the space, soft and gray, filtering through the mountain mist that drifts past open arches on every side. The spiral continues upward, each step worn smooth by centuries of passage. Stone curves inward, forming walls that embrace the ascending path. Cold air flows down from above, carrying the faint scent of weathered wood and ancient dust. The curve of the stairwell draws the path higher, spiraling through darkness broken only by occasional shafts of pale light. A narrow window opens in the stone, no wider than a hand span. Morning mist presses against the glass, obscuring the mountains beyond. Light filters through in muted gray, casting a soft glow on the worn steps ahead. The air grows colder here, touched by the mountain wind that seeps through gaps in the ancient masonry. Stone walls glisten with condensation, smooth and damp beneath the dim illumination. The passage narrows as the spiral tightens, drawing closer to the tower's heart. Rough-hewn beams appear overhead, dark timbers supporting the weight of stone above. Cobwebs drift in corners where light cannot reach, swaying gently in the subtle current of air. The steps grow steeper now, each rise more pronounced, carved deep into the rock. Somewhere above, the bell chamber waits in silence, suspended in the tower's uppermost reaches. The stairwell opens slightly, widening as it approaches the threshold above. A wooden beam crosses overhead, marked by iron brackets blackened with age. Pale light grows stronger, filtering down from the chamber beyond. The air carries a different quality here, resonant, and still, as if the space ahead holds its breath in patient waiting. The spiral continues its patient climb, stone worn smooth by centuries of passage. Narrow slits in the outer wall admit pale beams of morning light, each one catching particles of dust suspended in the cool air. The temperature drops slightly with every turn, as though the height itself brings the chill of the surrounding peaks closer. A faint breeze whispers through the openings, carrying the scent of distant pine and cold mist. The stonework becomes rougher here, less finished, as the tower reaches toward its upper reaches. Iron brackets, dark with age and moisture, emerge from the walls at intervals, their purpose long forgotten, or perhaps awaiting ropes and pulleys once kept elsewhere. The steps grow slightly narrower, carved from the same gray stone that forms the monastery's foundation. Shadows pool in the curves ahead, softening as daylight filters down from somewhere above, a promise of the bell chamber drawing nearer with each gentle turn. A small alcove appears in the wall, barely large enough to hold a simple wooden shelf, weathered and empty now. The stone around it bears the faint marks of chisel work, deliberate and careful. Above, the spiral tightens just slightly, and the sound of wind becomes more present. A low murmur that speaks of open space waiting beyond. The air carries a metallic hint now, the unmistakable presence of bronze resting in stillness. Light grows stronger, spilling down in wider shafts, illuminating the final turns of the ancient stairway as it approaches the threshold of the chamber above. The spiral continues upward, each stone step worn smooth by centuries of passage. The wall curves close on one side, rough and cool to touch, while the center column rises like an ancient spine of the tower. Grooves worn into the stone mark where countless moments have passed. The air grows cooler still, carrying the faint scent of old rope and weathered timber from somewhere above. A narrow window breaks the stone, casting a pale beam of morning light across the ascending passage. Dust drifts slowly through the glow, suspended and turning. The light catches the grain of the stone, revealing bands of gray and amber laid down over ages. Beyond the window, mist clings to the mountain slopes, soft and white against the distant peaks. The cold glass pane holds condensation at its edges, small droplets catching the light like crystals. The passage narrows as it climbs, the ceiling lowering to meet the rising floor. Stone blocks fit together with precision, their mortar dark with age. Here and there, small iron brackets jut from the wall, perhaps once holding oil lamps or guiding ropes. The metal has oxidized to a deep brown, rough beneath its patina. The spiral tightens, turning more sharply now, each revolution bringing the walls closer, the space more intimate. Above, the passage brightens. The stone ceiling opens into shadow, suggesting a chamber beyond. The sound changes subtly, less confined, as if the air has found more room to settle. The final steps lead upward into dimness, toward the waiting silence of the bell chamber. The spiral grows tighter now, the stone walls drawing closer on either side. Cold radiates from the ancient blocks, each one fitted centuries ago, without mortar. held by weight and time alone. The steps narrow as the passage climbs, their centers worn into smooth hollows by endless repetition. Pale light filters down from somewhere above, growing stronger with each upward turn. A draft descends through the tower, carrying the crisp bite of mountain air. It flows past the worn stones, stirring faint traces of dust that drift through the beams of morning light. The walls bear the patina of ages, darkened where moisture has seeped through, lighter where countless passages have polished the surface. Small niches carved into the outer wall hold nothing now but shadow and the memory of candles long extinguished. The passage opens slightly as the stairs continue their patient spiral. Through a narrow window slit, a fragment of sky appears, pale gray, touched with the first suggestion of dawn. The world beyond remains veiled in mist, only the nearest slopes visible as darker masses against the lightening air. The bronze bell waits somewhere above, silent in its chamber, suspended by ancient ropes that creak softly in the mountain wind. The tower holds its breath in these final moments before the morning hour arrives. Dust drifts through thin shafts of morning light. The tower room stands silent, its stone walls rising into shadow above. At the center, the bronze bell hangs motionless, suspended by thick ropes that disappear into the timber framework overhead. The metal surface catches the pale beams, reflecting soft amber where the light touches, while the rest remains in cool darkness. Particles drift slowly through the air, turning lazy spirals in the stillness. The ropes are weathered hemp, wound around wooden pulleys worn smooth by years of use. Each strand shows the grain of age, fibers compressed and darkened where the weight has pressed. Below the bell, the stone floor bears a patina of use, swept clean but marked by time. A narrow window on the eastern wall admits the morning, its frame cut deep into the thick stone, edges softened by centuries of wind and rain. The bell itself is a presence of weight and permanence. Its bronze surface shows the faint trace of cast lines, the seam where molten metal once joined. Near the crown, where the ropes attach, the metal is darker, polished by friction and contact. The lip curves outward in a smooth arc, thick and solid, designed to resonate through stone and mountain air alike. Even in stillness, it seems to hold the echo of every note it has ever sung. The tower room breathes quietly with the mountain morning. Cold air settles near the floor, while warmer currents rise toward the beams. Dust continues its slow dance through the light, undisturbed, marking time in the ancient chamber. The chamber settles into deeper stillness. Stone walls curve upward into shadow, their surface worn smooth by centuries of mountain wind and rain. Thin cracks trace wandering paths through the masonry, each line a record of seasons passing, of frost and thaw, of time moving slowly through this high place. The air holds a coolness that never quite leaves. Even in summer months, a permanent chill drawn from the depths of the stone itself. Above, the wooden framework that supports the bell shows its age in the grain of the timber. Dark beams cross the tower space, their surfaces darkened by decades of smoke from candles and braziers far below. The wood has contracted and expanded through countless cycles, forming small gaps where the joints meet, spaces where the morning light finds passage. Rope fibers show their texture where they loop through iron rings, each strand twisted tight, bearing weight in patient silence. The narrow windows set into the tower walls frame views of distant peaks, their slopes draped in mist that shifts and thins with the rising sun outside. The world awakens slowly. Birds trace invisible paths through the cold air. The monastery rooftops below catch the growing light, tiles gleaming with overnight dew. Everything waits in the gentle progression of morning, unhurried and calm, as it has waited for generations within these ancient walls. The bell chamber remains a place of quiet permanence. Suspended between earth and sky, dust continues its slow dance through the light. The bronze surface holds its luster in shadow. Time moves through this space like water through stone, shaping everything gradually, leaving marks too subtle to see in a single moment, yet profound across the years. The bell rests in perfect stillness now, its dark bronze surface cool in the tower's quiet air. Particles of dust continue their slow descent through the morning beams, catching the light as they fall. The weathered ropes that hold the bell in place hang taut and unmoving, their fibers marked by years of service. Stone walls rise around the chamber, their surfaces smooth, where countless seasons have worn away the rougher edges. Shadows pool in the corners where the light does not reach, creating deep pockets of darkness against the pale stone. The bell's clapper rests against the inner curve of bronze, silent and still. Above, the wooden beams that support the bell frame show the grain of old timber, each line a record of growth and time. The mountain air that enters through the narrow windows carries the faint scent of stone and metal, mingling with the dust that floats unseen in the darker spaces. The floor beneath the bell is worn smooth by the passage of years, its surface marked only by the gentle accumulation of dust and the faint impressions left by rope and wood. Morning light shifts, almost imperceptibly, as the sun climbs higher beyond the mountains, causing the beams that pierce the chamber to lengthen and narrow. The bronze remains cool to the touch of the air, holding the night's chill even as daylight strengthens. Every surface in the tower room exists in harmony with the stillness. The chamber breathes with the mountain itself, a space carved from stone and filled with patient silence. The bell hangs in its appointed place, waiting as it has always waited, a presence both solid and serene. Outside, the mists begin their slow retreat down the slopes. But here in the tower, time moves differently, measured not in moments, but in the steady, unchanging peace of ancient walls and bronze. The morning has deepened into quiet hours, and the tower chamber rests in stillness. Shadows have shifted along the curved walls, shortening as daylight climbs higher beyond the narrow windows. The bronze surface of the bell reflects faint patterns of light, muted gleams that trace the aged metal's gentle curves and the patina of decades. Each rope hangs in perfect vertical alignment, motionless in the absence of wind. Stone absorbs the silence, holding it within the cool mass of the tower. The wooden beam overhead shows the grain of its age. Dark lines tracing years of strain and rest. Dust continues its slow drift through the air, visible only where thin light catches each particle and suspension. The floor beneath the bell bears faint marks, worn smooth by the passage of seasons, subtle indentations that speak of weight and time without urgency. Beyond the windows, the mountain mist has thinned to transparency, revealing distant ridges layered in shades of gray and blue. The air within the chamber holds a coolness that belongs to stone and altitude, unchanging through the hours. Small imperfections in the bell's surface catch light differently as the sun continues its arc. A slow transformation of shadow and gleam that requires no witness to unfold. The chamber waits in its ancient rhythm, neither expectant nor empty, simply present. The bell hangs centered in its space, balanced by rope and beam, a vessel of bronze holding potential sound in the quiet. Time moves through the tower as it always has, measured not in moments but in the gradual shift of light across stone, in the patient stillness of metal and wood and mountain air. The tower room settles deeper into stillness. Stone walls hold the coolness of mountain air, undisturbed and constant. Far below, the monastery courtyard lies in shadow, while up here the bronze surface catches the last traces of morning light. A warm glow against gray stone. The metal seems almost alive in its quietness, absorbing the soft illumination that filters through the narrow windows. Weathered ropes rest against the bell's crown, their fibers darkened by years of use and mountain moisture. Each strand shows the patience of time, twisted and wound with careful precision. The wooden wheel above turns imperceptibly in the faint breeze that sneaks through gaps in the stonework. A whisper of movement in the otherwise motionless chamber. Dust motes trace slow spirals through the air, suspended in shafts of light that grow softer as clouds drift across the distant peaks. The floor beneath spreads smooth and worn, centuries of footsteps having polished the stone to a gentle sheen. Small cracks web outward from the bell's mounting, natural fractures that speak of age rather than weakness. In the corners, shadows pool deep and unchanging, untouched by the moving light. The chamber breathes with a rhythm all its own. A space designed for sound, but now cradling only silence. Waiting with infinite patience for the next call to prayer. The next marking of time in this timeless mountain sanctuary. The chamber settles into stillness as the morning deepens. Pale light climbs higher along the eastern wall, warming the stone from gray to amber. The wooden frame that supports the bell stands solid, its timbers dark with age and the friction of countless rings. Dust motes drift lazily through the air, suspended in the quiet, tracing invisible currents that move through the tower with the patience of centuries. The bronze surface of the bell holds a faint sheen where light touches it, a constellation of scratches and dents accumulated over years of faithful service. The metal is cool and still, no vibration disturbing its silence. Above, the arrangement of ropes loops through iron rings and wooden pulleys, their fibers worn smooth by use, each strand contributing to the suspension that keeps the great bell centered and ready. The whole assembly rests in equilibrium, a balance of weight and tension perfected through time. Narrow windows encircle the chamber, each one a portal to the mountain air beyond. Through them, the mist continues its slow retreat down the slopes, revealing the dark green of distant pines and the pale outcrops of rock that rise from the valleys below. A cool breeze finds its way inside, carrying the scent of moss and stone, stirring the dust into gentle spirals. The air tastes of altitude and silence, clean and thin, a reminder of the heights to which this tower reaches. The bell chamber waits in its ancient purpose, unchanged by the passing of this single morning. Stone and bronze, wood and rope, all holding their places in the tower. The light continues its slow arc across the floor, marking time and silence, while the mountains stand eternal beyond the windows, wrapped in mist and memory. Vibrations linger in the wood and stone. The bronze bell has fallen silent, yet the tower itself continues to hum with the memory of sound. Ancient beams creak softly, releasing the energy they have absorbed. The weathered ropes sway gently, settling back into stillness. Dust motes dance in the narrow window light, disturbed by the invisible waves that rippled through the air. The stone walls hold the resonance deep within their mass. A tremor felt more than heard, slowly fading into the mountain's bones. Beyond the monastery walls, the tone travels outward across the steep valleys. It rolls over terraced slopes where wild grasses bend in the midday breeze. The sound skims across stone outcrops, softening as it stretches toward the tree line. Pine forests catch the fading echo, needles trembling as the vibration passes through their branches. The deep note washes over ravines and ridges, growing thinner with distance, dissolving into the vast quietness of the mountains. Birdsong pauses, then resumes, woven into the silence left behind. In the corridors below the tower, the stone amplifies the last whispers of the bell's call. Cold air holds the sound a moment longer, carrying it through archways and past worn steps. Shadows pool in corners where sunlight cannot reach. The chill of the mountain seeps through gaps in the masonry, mingling with the warmth of midday that filters through narrow windows. Each surface, each carved edge of stone, has absorbed countless bells over the decades, layering memory upon memory. The monastery breathes in rhythm with the hours, patient and unhurried. High above, the bell rests in its wooden cradle, bronze surface cool to the mountain air. The rope hangs, motionless now, fibers catching the slanted light. Dust settles once more on the tower floor. The valleys below stretch vast and quiet, forests darkening in the folds of distant ridges. The monastery stands as it has for generations, marking time with bronze and stone. A sentinel in the mist and silence of the peaks. The sound travels outward in invisible rings, layer upon layer, diminishing as it meets the distant ridges. Far below the tower, the valley absorbs the tone into its moss-covered slopes and stands of ancient pine. A faint tremor remains in the weathered ropes, still swaying from the pull, their fibers creaking softly against the wooden beam. The bronze surface of the bell itself holds warmth where the clappers struck, undisturbed now as the air settles. The stone chamber returns to its patient stillness, the thick walls absorbing what remains of the echo. Outside, the mist that clings to the monastery's lower terraces shifts lazily, neither rising nor falling, simply existing in the midday calm. The carved wooden supports beneath the bell, darkened by decades of weather and friction, rest motionless once more, their grain marked with the subtle impressions of countless repetitions. In the valleys below, pine needles trembling imperceptibly before returning to quiet. The rocky outcroppings that line the mountain paths hold no memory of the vibration, their surfaces cool and unchanging beneath the diffused sunlight. Back within the tower, a single narrow window frames a view of layered ridges, each peak fading to a paler blue in the distance. The iron hinges of the tower door remain still, their rust-touched surfaces unmoved by breeze or disturbance. Silence reclaims the stone corridors, deep and complete, as though the bell had never sounded at all. The monastery settles into the patient rhythm of the afternoon, waiting beneath the endless sky. The last echoes drift away across the valley, dissolving into the vastness of the mountain range. Silence settles once more over the tower, thick and cushioned, broken only by the faint whisper of wind threading through the open arches. The bronze surface of the bell gleams softly in the midday light, its patina catching greens and deep golds where sunlight touches. The weathered ropes hang motionless now, their fibers still and undisturbed in the calm air. Far below, the valleys hold on to the memory of sound, invisible waves spreading outward through pine forests and hidden ravines. The stone walls of the monastery absorb the warmth of noon, radiating a gentle heat that softens the perpetual coolness of these heights. Dust motes spiral lazily through the narrow window beams, golden trails suspended in stillness. The wooden frame supporting the bell creaks faintly, an almost imperceptible shift as old timbers settle back into their ancient grooves. Outside the tower, the mountain air carries the distant scent of resin and cold stone. Clouds drift past the peaks in slow procession, their shadows sweeping across the monastery grounds in languid patterns of light and shade. The bell tower stands silent sentinel, its openings framing pieces of sky and forest, fragments of the endless landscape. The bronze bell rests in perfect stillness, its purpose fulfilled for now, waiting in the timeless patience that defines these heights. The monastery settles into the deep quiet of midday, when even the wind seems to pause and rest. Stone and wood, metal and rope, all return to their vigil, Holding space for the hours yet to come, the final echoes drift away, leaving only the mountain wind and the creak of ancient timbers. Dust motes hang suspended in the tower's stillness, swirling gently where the air itself remembers motion. The bronze surface cools degree by degree, releasing the day's warmth back into the shadowed space. Far below, the monastery courtyard basks in full noon light. Smooth flagstones radiate heat, their gray surfaces marked by decades of weather and wear. A small fountain trickles steadily in the corner, its water catching fragments of sky. The sound is delicate, a counterpoint to the bell's fading memory. Inside the chapel, shafts of sunlight pierce narrow windows, painting long rectangles across stone walls and wooden pews. The air is cool and still, scented faintly with beeswax and aged timber. Carved pillars rise into shadow, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries. Everything rests in profound quiet, held in the pause between hours. The last echoes settle into the mountain slopes, absorbed by pine and fir that climb the ridges beyond the monastery walls. The bell tower stands silent once more, its bronze voice spent, while the ropes sway gently in the draft that rises through the open chamber. Dust motes drift through the shaft of midday light, turning slowly in the current of air still disturbed by the bell's motion. Far below, in the valleys that fold away from the monastery's height, the sound has traveled to its furthest reaches. Meadows lie still under the high sun, their grasses motionless in the mountain, calm. The tone has faded now into the texture of the afternoon itself, a memory held in the bark of distant trees and the moss-covered stones that mark ancient paths through the forest. The mountain air carries only the whisper of wind through needle and leaf. Back within the tower, the wooden beams hold a faint warmth where the vibration passed through them. The bell itself hangs motionless, its surface catching the light in a curve of burnished bronze. The stone chamber absorbs the stillness, each block fitted to its neighbor in patient permanence, cool and solid. Through the narrow window openings, the mountains stretch away in layers of blue and gray, ridge upon ridge beneath the pale dome of sky. Midday settles over all, a pause between the tolling hours, deep and unbroken. The monastery rests in its appointed silence, the bell waiting once more for the appointed time. The last threads of the bell's song drift beyond the outer walls, carried on currents of mountain air. Each wave of sound travels outward through the valley below, rolling over terraced slopes and scattered pines. The tone grows fainter with distance, softening into a gentle hum that blends with the rustle of leaves and the whisper of wind through rocky crevices. Far below, the sound dissolves into silence, leaving only the memory of bronze and vibration. Within the tower, stillness returns. Dust motes hang motionless in the slanting beams of midday light. The bronze surface of the bell gleams softly, its patina of age and weather catching the sun. The wooden beams overhead hold their ancient positions, darkened by centuries of smoke and weather. Cold stone walls absorb the warmth of noon, their rough surfaces textured with lichen and the slow erosion of mountain winters. Outside the narrow windows, the sky stretches pale and clear above the peaks. Mist has retreated to the deepest valleys, leaving the high ridges sharp against the horizon. The monastery stands in its eternal place, stone upon stone, weathered and enduring. The bell rope hangs slack once more, swaying slightly in the draft that moves through the tower. Time flows forward in its measured way, marked by light and shadow, by bronze and stone and the patient passage of hours. The mountains hold their silence. The bell rests, cool and still, waiting for the next appointed hour, when its voice will rise again to mark the turning day. Wind whispers through arched corridors. The afternoon has settled into a gentle hush. The courtyard bathed in amber light that slants low across the flagstones. Shadows stretch long and thin, tracing the curve of each archway, the edge of each worn stone step. The air has grown cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of mountain herbs and ancient mortar. Dust motes drift lazily through narrow window beams, suspended in golden shafts that illuminate the texture of centuries-old walls. In the bell tower above, the great bronze surface rests motionless, its patina gleaming softly in the diffused light. The weathered ropes hang perfectly still, undisturbed by even the slightest tremor. Far beyond the monastery walls, the mountains rise in layered silhouettes, their peaks dissolving into mist that shifts and curls with imperceptible slowness. The silence is profound, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind, finding its way through stone passages, a breath that stirs nothing but itself. The courtyard flagstones hold the memory of warmth from earlier hours, their surfaces now cool to the touch as afternoon deepens toward evening. Lichen patterns the northern walls in soft greens and grays, each patch a constellation of patient growth. Through the arched openings, the view extends to terraced slopes, where wild grasses bend in unison, their seed heads catching the slanting light. The monastery stands rooted in this stillness, stone upon stone, each block fitted with care long ago, and held now only by gravity and time. High above, wooden beams cross the tower's ceiling, darkened by age and weather. The bell's suspension frame, constructed of heavy timber and iron brackets, casts intricate shadows that shift slowly as the sun continues its descent. Everything rests in perfect equilibrium. The day holds its breath, neither advancing nor retreating, simply dwelling in this moment of quiet suspension between the hours of light and the coming dusk. The courtyard stones hold warmth from the day, releasing it slowly into the cooling air. Each flagstone bears the patina of centuries, edges worn smooth by time and weather. Small pools of shadow gather in the worn depressions, deepening as the sun slides lower behind the mountain peaks. The well at the courtyard's center stands silent, its rope coiled neatly on the worn rim. In the western cloister, light slants through the narrow windows at a steep angle now, painting golden rectangles across the stone floor. Dust motes drift lazily through these beams, swirling in imperceptible currents. The wooden benches along the wall rest in half-shadow, their surfaces cool to the touch where sunlight no longer reaches. A single leaf, carried in from the mountain forest, lies motionless on the threshold. The bell tower's shadow stretches long across the courtyard now, a dark finger pointing eastward toward the distant valleys below. The tower stones themselves hold on to the afternoon warmth, radiating it gently into the quiet air. High above, the weathered ropes hang still, their fibers dark against the last brightness of sky visible through the upper windows. Everything waits in this suspended hour between day and evening. The mountain air grows crisp, carrying with it the scent of pine and ancient stone. Somewhere far below, water tumbles over rocks in an unseen stream. The monastery rests in perfect stillness, patient as the mountains themselves. The courtyard lies quiet beneath the settling afternoon. Shadows have crept across the flagstones, stretching from the western wall in long, unbroken lines. The stone underfoot holds the memory of sunlight, cooling slowly as the air grows still. A thin veil of cloud softens the light, casting everything in muted tones of gray and amber. In the tower above, the bronze bell rests silent in its wooden frame. Dust motes drift through the narrow window, caught in the pale beam that slants across worn stone. The weathered ropes hang motionless, their fibers darkened by time and mountain mist. Far below, the corridors hold their breath, empty of sound, save for the faint rustle of wind through distant archways. The mountains beyond the monastery walls stand wrapped in layers of haze, their peaks softened by distance and approaching evening. Cold air moves gently through the cloisters, carrying with it the scent of stone and altitude. The flagstones in the courtyard have fallen entirely into shadow now, their surfaces smooth and dark. Each breath of wind seems to settle rather than stir, as though the day itself is easing into rest. Stillness deepens. The bell tower stands sentinel against the pale sky, its weathered stones absorbing the last diffuse light of afternoon. All is quiet. All is calm. As the hours drift toward dusk, the courtyard rests in deepening quiet. Long shadows stretch across the flagstones, reaching from the western wall toward the base of the bell tower. Each stone edge casts its own thin line of darkness, creating a pattern of light and shade that shifts slowly, imperceptibly, as the afternoon sun arcs lower through the mountain sky. The air has grown cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of stone warmed through the day, now beginning to release its stored heat. In the tower above, dust motes drift through slanting beams that pour through the narrow windows. The bronze bell hangs motionless in its frame, its surface dappled with patches of golden light and deeper shadow. The worn hemp of the ropes shows every fiber in this illumination, each strand visible where it loops around the wooden pulley. The timber beam overhead displays the grain of ancient wood darkened by decades of weather and use, solid and unchanging. The stone steps winding upward rest, undisturbed, each tread worn smooth at its center from countless passages over the years. The curve of the wall follows the spiral, cold to the touch. Its surface uneven, where mortar has settled between blocks. Higher still, where the stairway meets the bell chamber. The afternoon light pools on the threshold, a rectangle of brightness against gray stone that will fade as evening approaches. Outside, the mountain wind moves gently through the arched corridors. A soft, continuous whisper that touches nothing, disturbs nothing. The monastery settles into the stillness of late afternoon, peaceful and patient, as shadows continue their slow march across ancient stone. The courtyard rests in deepening quiet. Shadows have stretched their full length across the flagstones, pooling in the corners where walls meet ground. The stone absorbs the coolness of approaching evening, releasing the warmth gathered through midday hours. A few stray leaves skitter across the weathered surface, tracing irregular paths before settling against the base of the fountain. The water within reflects the pale sky, still and mirror smooth. In the bell tower above, the bronze surface has lost its earlier glow. The metal holds a muted luster now, dim in the softer light that filters through the narrow openings. Dust motes hang suspended in the slanting beams, drifting without haste through the cool air. The ropes descend in their ancient arrangement, motionless, their fibers barely visible in the gathering shadows. Everything waits in this stillness, patient and undisturbed. The arched corridors hold the day's final breath of warmth. Stone columns stand in their endless vigil, their surfaces traced with the faint textures of centuries. Where sunlight once poured through the windows, only gentle amber remains. Soft and fading, the flagstones underfoot show their wear, smooth and slightly concave, where countless seasons have passed. A distant mountain breeze finds its way through the passages, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone, whispering through the empty spaces with the gentlest of sounds. The monastery settles into its afternoon repose. Silence wraps around every surface, every corner, every threshold. The mountains beyond hold their watch, shrouded in mist that thickens as the light wanes. All is calm. All is still. The stones remember this hour, as they have remembered every hour before, waiting peacefully for the next turn of the bell, the next marking of time, in this quiet, timeless place. The afternoon has deepened into a softer light. Silence rests across the courtyard, undisturbed, save for the occasional flutter of a dove's wing against stone. The flagstones lie cool beneath the lengthening shadows cast by the tower and walls. Each rectangular stone holds a different shade now, some still touched by pale sunlight, others already claimed by the advancing dusk. The air is perfectly still, carrying only the faint mineral scent of ancient mortar and mountain stone. Inside the corridors, the temperature has dropped with the sun's descent. The arched passageways hold on to the chill, their stones radiating the cold accumulated through centuries of mountain winters. Dust motes hang motionless in the narrow shafts of amber light that slant through the windows. The worn steps leading upward toward the bell tower show their age in this gentle illumination. Each depression and groove, carved by countless ascents, now filled with shadow. The weathered wood of the tower door stands closed. Its iron hinges dark against the pale timber. The bell tower itself is wrapped in stillness. The great bronze bell hangs motionless in its wooden frame, its surface catching faint glimmers of light from the high windows. The ropes descend through the quiet air, their fibers coiled and waiting. Beyond the tower's narrow openings, the mountain peaks have begun to glow with the softer hues of late afternoon, their mist-wrapped slopes transitioning from gray to violet. The distant valleys are already filling with shadow, while the monastery remains suspended in this gentle threshold between day and evening. Everything waits, patient and timeless, for the next appointed hour. Warm tones paint the gray stone amber. The sun descends toward the mountain ridge, and its low angle sends golden light through the narrow windows of the tower. Each beam slants across the ancient walls, touching the worn steps with a honey-colored radiance. Dust motes drift lazily through the illuminated air, tiny specks suspended in the stillness. The stone, cold and colorless through most of the day, now glows with warmth, as though the monastery itself has absorbed the last measure of daylight. The bronze bell hangs in shadow, but ribbons of amber light trace the curve of its rim. The metal surface catches the softest glow, revealing patterns in the patina, the subtle marks of decades. The weathered ropes that suspend it appear almost golden where the light touches them, their rough fibers illuminated against the dimness of the bell chamber. Outside, the mist begins to shift, thinning in places, thickening in others. As the cool evening air settles over the peaks, the light filters through this veil, scattering into a diffused radiance that softens every edge. The corridors below take on a gentle warmth. Where the small windows open onto the courtyard, amber light pools on the stone floor, stretching long shadows from the simple wooden framework. The walls seem to breathe with color, transformed from their usual gray into shades of ochre and rust. Even the cold mountain air feels softer now, as though the evening light carries with it a quiet tenderness. The silence deepens, broken only by the faint whisper of wind moving through the high places. A breath that stirs nothing but itself. The day softens into dusk, and the golden light begins its slow retreat. The beams grow thinner. The warmth fades by degrees, and the stone releases the glow it briefly held. Shadows lengthen and merge, filling the spaces where light once lingered. The monastery settles into the hush of evening, the last amber traces clinging to the highest edges of the tower before slipping away into the gathering blue. The amber light deepens, pooling on the worn stone steps where centuries of passage have smoothed the edges. Each tread holds a shallow depression at its center, polished smooth by time and use. The golden rays slant lower now, stretching longer across the corridor floor, transforming the cold gray into bands of honeyed warmth. In the bell tower, the bronze surface catches the fading sunlight, glowing as if lit from within. The metal holds the day's warmth, radiating a gentle heat into the cooling evening air. The thick ropes that suspend the bell hang motionless, their woven fibers casting delicate shadows that shift as the light moves. Dust motes drift through the amber beams, suspended and turning, tiny specks of gold against the darkening corners. The narrow windows frame the sky beyond, where pale orange fades to softest pink. The stone walls absorb the last of the sun's warmth, releasing the chill they held from dawn. The wooden pulley beams, aged and smooth, glow with a rich amber patina. Every surface touched by the evening light seems transformed, softened, gentled by the slow transition from day to dusk. The monastery settles into stillness. The golden light retreats, climbing higher on the tower walls, growing fainter and more precious as it withdraws. Soon, only the uppermost stones hold the glow. Then even that fades, leaving the bell tower bathed in the soft blue of twilight. The amber light deepens along the worn stone steps, each tread glowing with the last warmth of day. Dust motes drift slower now, suspended in the thickening golden beams that stretch from window to wall. The mountain air grows cooler, settling into the tower, carrying with it the faint mineral scent of distant snow peaks. Shadows lengthen across the corridor floor, pooling in the hollows where countless footsteps have worn the stone smooth over generations. In the bell chamber above, the bronze surface catches the fading light, reflecting patterns of amber and copper across the weathered wooden beams. The ropes hang still, darker now against the luminous air. Through the narrow, arched openings, the valley below begins to blur into soft twilight, the mist rising from the forested slopes to meet the descending dusk. The stone walls hold the day's warmth, radiating it gently back into the cooling space. A quiet exchange between sun-soaked rock and evening chill. The bell's shadow stretches long across the chamber floor, a dark crescent that shifts almost imperceptibly as the sun sinks lower behind the western peaks. The iron mounting brackets glow faintly, traced with the last direct rays. Below, in the stone corridors, the light becomes softer still, more suggestion than illumination, painting the monastery in shades of honey and slate. The air itself seems to hold the color, as if the day's warmth has become visible in these final moments, before twilight claims the mountain. The wooden pulley wheel darkens to silhouette against the pale sky beyond the tower opening. One last beam finds its way through the western window, illuminating a patch of stone floor in liquid gold, glowing as if lit from within. Then, gently, the direct sunlight withdraws, leaving only the soft, reflected radiance of evening. The monastery settles into dusk, wrapped in the quiet peace of transition. The amber light deepens along the worn edges of the stone steps, pooling in the gentle hollows carved by centuries of passage. Dust motes drift lazily through the slanting beams, each particle glowing like a tiny ember suspended in the cooling air. The bronze bell hangs in perfect stillness, its surface collecting the golden hue until the metal itself seems to hold the warmth of the fading day. Outside the narrow windows, the mountain mist begins to thicken, softening the distant peaks into layers of deepening blue and violet. The last rays of sunlight paint the uppermost stones of the tower, casting long shadows that stretch across the floor and climb the opposite walls. A gentle coolness settles into the corridor, mingling with the lingering warmth trapped in the thick stone. The weathered ropes hang motionless beside the bell, their fibers catching threads of amber light that trace the weave and twist of the hemp. On the wooden beams overhead, the grain stands out in sharp relief, each ridge and valley illuminated by the sideways glow. The day's brightness fades gradually, surrendering to the softer tones of approaching twilight. The monastery settles into the quiet transition between day and night, wrapped in the gentle embrace of evening. The golden light retreats inch by inch, leaving only the memory of warmth on the ancient stone. The amber light has deepened now, pooling in the worn hollows of the stone steps. Each depression holds its own small reservoir of warmth, golden and thick as honey. The granite surfaces that face the windows glow softly, while the shadowed recesses have turned to deep violet. The temperature of the air itself seems to shift with the color, cooling degree by degree as the sun descends behind the mountain peaks. In the bell chamber, the bronze surface captures the last direct rays, transforming the metal into molten copper. The ancient patina, green and dark by day, becomes almost translucent in this slanting light. Dust motes drift in the golden beams, each particle illuminated, suspended, tracing the invisible currents that move through the tower. The wooden beams overhead catch the glow along their edges, highlighting every grain and crack earned through decades beneath this roof. The narrow windows frame the changing sky in perfect rectangles, where morning brought pale silver. Evening offers layers of apricot and rose, fading upward into the first hint of twilight blue. The light no longer streams but settles, resting on every horizontal surface. The rope coiled near the tower entrance absorbs the warmth, its fibers softened by the glow. Even the cold mountain air entering through the windows feels gentler now, carrying the scent of cooling stone and distant pine. The contrast fades slowly. Amber gives way to softer tones, the sharpness of shadow and light blending into a more uniform dusk. The monastery walls hold the warmth of the day within their thickness, releasing it gradually into the evening air. The bell waits in its dimming chamber, silent and still, as the golden hour completes its quiet passage into night. The amber light lingers on the uppermost edges of the tower walls, painting thin stripes across the ancient stone. Dust motes drift lazily through the golden beams, suspended in the stillness. The bronze surface of the bell glows softly, reflecting the warmth of the fading sun in subtle ripples across its aged patina. Shadows deepen in the corners where the light cannot reach, pooling like water against the curved walls. The rope hangs motionless, its fibers catching the last amber rays in a gentle cascade of warm browns and golds. Outside the narrow windows, the mountain mist begins to thicken, softening the distant peaks into pale silhouettes against the dimming sky. The stone floor radiates the day's accumulated warmth back into the cooling air, a gentle exchange between earth and atmosphere. Each grain of dust, each weathered crack in the mortar, holds the amber glow a moment longer before surrendering to the approaching dusk. The wooden beam overhead darkens from honey to oak, its grain emerging in deeper relief as the angle of light shifts ever downward. Stillness settles over the tower like a blanket, the air cool and peaceful. The last golden light withdraws from the stone, leaving only the quiet embrace of evening and the patient bronze bell waiting in the gathering shadows. The bell waits in shadow, patient and still. Darkness has settled over the mountains, and the last traces of daylight have withdrawn from the narrow windows of the tower. A single candle burns on the stone ledge, its flames swaying gently in the cold draught that seeps through the ancient walls. The bronze surface of the bell catches the warm glow, reflecting amber light across the worn grooves and weathered inscriptions. Outside, the mist has thickened into night, wrapping the monastery in layers of silence and stone. The candlelight flickers, casting shifting shadows across the timber framework and iron fittings that hold the bell in place. Wax pools slowly at the base of the taper, gathering in uneven ridges on the old stone. The flame dips and rises, painting the tower in tones of gold and charcoal. Beyond the open archway, stars begin to pierce the deepening sky, faint points of light above the dark ridge of peaks. The air grows colder, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine from the high slopes. The ropes hang motionless in the stillness, their fibers dark against the pale stone. The tower settles into the quiet of evening. Dust motes drift through the narrow beam of candlelight, suspended in the cool air like tiny constellations. The wooden beams overhead creak softly, expanding and contracting with the changing temperature. Far below, the stone corridors of the monastery rest in shadow, their arches and alcoves barely visible in the fading light. The bell remains centered in its ancient cradle, a presence both heavy and serene, waiting through the hours of darkness as it has waited through countless nights before. The candle burns steadily now, a small beacon in the vastness of stone and sky. Night deepens around the tower. The mountains stand as silhouettes against the stars, and the monastery becomes a place of whispers and stone, holding the quiet until dawn returns once more. The candle flame dips and recovers, casting a trembling oval of amber across the tower floor. Wax pools slowly at the base, forming a gentle curve along the worn iron holder. Beyond the narrow window, the last trace of violet has faded from the peaks, leaving only the deep indigo of gathering night. Cold air breathes through the stone frame, stirring the flame into a momentary dance. The bell's bronze surface holds no reflection now, swallowed by shadow. Only its lowest curve catches the faint glow from below, a thin crescent of warm light against cool darkness. The wooden beam overhead creaks softly as temperature drops, timber contracting with the night's embrace. Rope coils rest undisturbed in their corner. Fibers settled into stillness. Frost begins its quiet work on the outer sill. Crystals forming in delicate patterns along the weathered stone. The candle burns lower, its pool of light shrinking by imperceptible degrees. Far below, the courtyard stones radiate back the last warmth of the vanished sun. Cooling slowly beneath the mountain stars, the tower stands tall and steadfast, holding its vigil through the deepening hours. Silence settles like snowfall, layer upon layer, filling every corner and crevice of the chamber. The bell rests in its ancient suspension, bronze and wood and rope in perfect balance, waiting for the dawn that will come, patient as the mountains themselves. The stone floor of the tower absorbs the last traces of warmth from the vanished sun. Shadows deepen in every corner, pooling beneath the wooden wheel and along the weathered beams overhead. The candle flame bends and straightens in the gentle draft that whispers through the narrow openings, casting restless patterns across the rough-hewn walls. Darkness gathers softly, layer upon layer, like folded fabric, settling into place. Below, in the corridors, the cold mountain air grows colder still. Stone absorbs the twilight chill, holding it deep within ancient walls that have stood through countless such evenings. The iron sconces along the passageways remain unlit, their brackets dark against pale stone. Faint starlight begins to pierce the high windows. Thin silver threads that barely reach the worn steps, spiraling downward into deeper shadow. Outside, the mountains fade to silhouettes against a darkening sky. The mist that clung to the valleys through the afternoon has thinned, revealing distant peaks etched in shades of indigo and violet. The wind that stirred the grasses earlier has stilled, leaving the world suspended in a quiet hush. Far below, the forest stands motionless, a dark tapestry waiting for the night to complete its descent over the high places. In the bell tower, the bronze surface reflects the wavering candlelight in muted gleams. The ropes hang without motion, the wheel rests against its wooden frame. Twilight deepens into night, patient and unhurried, as the monastery settles into the peaceful darkness of another mountain evening. The last glow from the western window has faded to deepest violet. Candlelight pools on the stone floor, wavering gently in the draught that seeps through the tower. The flame bends and straightens, casting restless shadows across the wall where the ancient rope hangs coiled. Each flicker sends ripples of amber light over the bell's curved surface, revealing the texture of decades, the subtle variations in the bronze. Stars have begun to appear beyond the narrow arches, faint points of silver in the darkening sky. The mountains are silhouettes now, black against indigo, their peaks lost in the gathering night. A coolness rises from the stone steps below, carrying with it the scent of earth and weathered wood. The candle flame steadies, burning calm and bright, its light reflecting in the worn grooves of the wooden beam overhead. Darkness settles into the monastery like a familiar presence, filling corridors and alcoves with quiet shadow. The bell rests in its cradle of rope and timber, patient as always, touched only by the soft play of candlelight. The wax is burned lower, a small pool forming at the base, but the flame remains constant. Outside, the wind has stilled. The night deepens, tranquil and vast, holding the tower in its gentle embrace. All is stillness now. The candle glows, a single point of warmth in the stone chamber. The bell waits, silent and serene, as the hours of twilight give way to the quietude of full night. The candle flame bends in a draft that slips through the tower window. Shadows slide across the stone walls, lengthening and retracting with each flicker of light. The bronze surface of the bell catches brief glints, a constellation of tiny reflections dancing across its weathered patina. Darkness pools in the corners where the candlelight cannot reach, gathering like still water. Beyond the narrow opening, the mountains have become silhouettes against the deepening sky. The first stars prick through the twilight, cold and distant. The mist has settled into the valleys, filling them like a pale sea between darker shores. A faint breeze stirs the air, carrying the scent of stone and snow from the peaks above. The temperature drops as night claims the heights. The wooden beams overhead creak softly as they release the day's warmth. Dust motes hang suspended in the amber cone of candlelight, drifting without purpose. The rope coiled near the bell rests undisturbed, its fibers shadowed and still. Stone steps leading down from the tower fade into darkness below, each worn tread holding the memory of countless passages. The monastery settles into its nightly quiet. The candle burns steadily now, its flame a single point of warmth in the cooling tower. The bell hangs in patient silence, waiting for the hour that will call it back to voice. Until then, the twilight watch continues in stillness and shadow. The last traces of daylight fade from the narrow tower windows, leaving only the soft glow of candle flame against ancient stone. Wax pools slowly at the base, a steady drip marking time in its own quiet rhythm. Shadows dance across the weathered surface of the bell, tracing the patterns of old bronze, the patina of countless seasons. Beyond the monastery walls, the mountain darkness deepens, a vast stillness settling over distant peaks and hidden valleys. The mist has thickened with nightfall, wrapping the stone building in layers of cool, damp air. Inside the tower, the temperature drops steadily, and the rope hangs motionless, coiled and waiting. Dust motes drift lazily through the candlelight, suspended in the quiet. The wooden beams overhead creak softly as the stone structure settles into evening's embrace. Cold seeps through the walls, ancient mortar holding firm against the mountain wind that whispers through cracks and crevices. The bell rests in its cradle of iron and timber, patient as the stone itself, surrounded by the gentle hush of twilight. The flame continues its slow consumption of the candle, casting a warm pool of light that reaches just far enough to touch the bell's curved surface before dissolving into shadow. Night claims the tower completely now. leaving only that single point of light, steady and faithful. A small beacon in the mountain darkness. The bell waits, as it always has, cradled in silence and time. Only wind and distant echoes mark the hours. The monastery settles into deepest night. Stone walls holding the silence like a cupped hand around a candle flame. Stars multiply overhead, cold and crystalline in the mountain darkness. The air carries the sharp clarity of high altitude. Each breath of wind threading through narrow windows and along corridors with the faintest whisper. In the bell tower, the great bronze form hangs motionless. A darker silhouette against the star-pricked sky visible through the arched openings. Frost begins to settle on the iron brackets and weathered wood of the belfry frame. The ropes, coiled and still, gather a fine crystalline dust of ice along their twisted fibers. Below, the stone steps descend into shadow, each worn tread holding the cold like water in a basin. The wooden door at the tower base rests secure in its frame. Gaps at the threshold, admitting thin currents of night air that smell of pine and distant snow. Moonlight, when it comes, falls in narrow shafts through eastern windows, painting silver lines across flagstone floors. The courtyard lies open to the heavens, its stones pale under starlight. The well stands centered, its low wall traced with frost, the bucket motionless on its chain. Beyond the monastery walls, the mountainside drops away into darkness, broken only by the occasional silhouette of pine or outcrop of stone. Wind moves through the valleys far below, a susurration that reaches the monastery as barely more than memory. The ghost of sound carried on currents too gentle to stir even the lightest covering of snow in the hours before dawn. The cold deepens. The bell metal holds the chill, its bronze surface smooth and frigid to the touch of air alone. The monastery breathes in slow rhythm with the mountain night. Stone and timber, iron and rope, all wrapped in the vast quiet. Stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, marking time in silence, waiting for the first pale hint of morning to soften the eastern sky. The night deepens around the ancient walls. Stone absorbs the cold, holding it in every corner, every crevice worn smooth by centuries. Starlight filters weakly through narrow windows, too faint to illuminate, only hinting at the shapes within. The air itself seems to settle, growing heavy and still, pressing down upon the worn flagstones of the corridor. In the bell tower, darkness gathers most completely. The great bronze bell hangs motionless in shadow, its surface invisible but present, a weight suspended in the black. The ropes that hold it rest without tension, coiled and dormant. Above, wooden beams creak softly as the temperature drops. Old timber contracting in the mountain cold. Each small sound travels through emptiness and fades. Outside, wind moves across the peaks in slow, patient currents. It brushes against the monastery walls, finding the gaps around shutters, whispering through cracks in mortar. The mist has thinned to nothing, leaving the air crystalline and sharp. Far below, somewhere in the unseen valleys, A faint echo drifts upward, a sound without source or meaning. Carried on the darkness and dissolving into it, the hours pass unmarked. Stone and bell and mountain rest together beneath the turning stars, waiting in a silence that asks nothing and promises only the slow, inevitable arrival of dawn. The stone floors hold the last whispers of warmth from the day, now surrendering fully to the mountain cold. Frost traces delicate patterns along the edges of window frames, each crystal catching faint starlight. The corridors stretch empty and still, their ancient walls absorbing the silence that settles like snow. Outside, the wind moves through distant pines, a sound so faint it seems part of the darkness itself. In the bell tower, the great bronze surface has grown cold to its core, the metal contracting with soft, barely audible creaks. The ropes hang motionless, their fibers stiff with night air. Above, the wooden beams radiate a chill that spreads downward through the tower's height. Stars wheel slowly overhead, their light filtering through narrow openings, casting pale geometry across worn planks and dust that has settled undisturbed. The chapel remains cloaked in shadow, its vaulted ceiling lost to darkness. Moonlight edges the tips of stone columns, revealing nothing more than their curved surfaces and the grain of ancient rock. Candle stubs sit cold in their iron holders, wax hardened and still. The air carries the faint memory of incense, mingled now with stone and winter. Each breath of wind outside sends the smallest whisper through gaps in shutters. A rhythm as steady as sleep, the monastery breathes in its own time, a place held between mountain and sky. The hours pass unmarked, save by the slow turn of constellations, the deepening cold, the stillness that blankets stone and timber alike. In this quiet, the world rests, waiting for the first pale edge of dawn. The stone steps leading down from the bell tower have grown cold beneath the night sky. Frost begins to trace the edges of each worn tread, delicate patterns, spreading slowly across surfaces polished by centuries. The air settles into deeper stillness, carrying only the faintest whisper of wind through narrow passages. Somewhere far below, a wooden door creaks softly on ancient hinges, the sound muted and distant, absorbed by layers of stone and shadow. In the bell chamber, the great bronze surface reflects nothing now. Wrapped in darkness broken only by starlight filtering through the open arches, the ropes hang motionless, their weathered fibers still and silent. Dust that rose during the evening hours has long since resettled, coating beams and brackets with a fine, undisturbed layer. The wooden wheel overhead remains locked in place, its grooves and notches invisible but present, waiting in the quiet. Cold mountain air moves through the space in slow currents, carrying the scent of stone and old timber, of altitudes where frost forms early and lingers long. Beyond the tower, The monastery courtyard lies empty beneath a canopy of stars. Flagstones radiate the day's last remnants of warmth into the freezing night, each paving stone outlined by thin lines of ice forming between the cracks. The fountain at the courtyard center stands silent, its basin dry, its carved edges sharp against the darkness. Shadows pool in doorways and beneath eaves, deep and unmoving. The mountain itself seems to draw closer in the darkness, its presence felt rather than seen, a weight of stone and slope pressing in from all sides. The hours of deepest night stretch ahead, measured only by the slow wheel of stars overhead and the gradual thickening of frost on stone. Silence wraps the monastery in layers, profound and complete, broken by nothing save the occasional breath of wind across distant peaks. Everything rests. Everything waits. The last echo has long since faded into the depths of the stone corridors. Silence settles through the passages, thick and undisturbed. The ancient walls hold their warmth loosely, surrendering it degree by degree to the night. Cold mountain air seeps through the narrow windows, carrying with it the crystalline scent of high altitude and distant snow. The bell tower stands dark against the stars, its wooden beams creaking softly in the wind. Above, the heavens stretch in brilliant clarity, unmarred by earthly light. Constellations wheel slowly overhead, their ancient patterns steady and eternal. The bronze bell hangs motionless in its cradle, reflecting starlight in dim gleams along its weathered surface. The ropes coil neatly beside it, still and patient. Below, the monastery grounds rest in shadow. The courtyard's empty, the stone paths silver with moonlight. Every surface seems to hold its breath. A gentle wind moves through the valley, ascending the slopes with a whisper that stirs nothing but itself. It passes through the tower openings, a soft note that rises and falls, then fades again. The stone absorbs the sound, drawing it into layers of mortar and time. In the corridors below, the cold settles more deeply, pooling in the low places, clinging to the worn steps. Dust motes rest undisturbed in the darkness, invisible but present. The night continues its slow procession. Hours pass without mark or measure, distinguished only by the wheeling stars and the deepening cold. The monastery stands as it has for generations, rooted in stone and silence, wrapped in the vast quietude of the mountains. The bell waits in its tower, patient and still, listening to the wind and the stars until dawn. The bell tower stands sentinel through the deepest hours, its ancient stones holding the gathered cold. Starlight filters through the narrow openings, casting pale geometry across the wooden frame and silent bronze. The ropes hang motionless, their texture softened by shadow. Each fiber of woven hemp rests undisturbed, waiting. The mountain air moves through the space in whispers, carrying the faint mineral scent of stone and the clean emptiness of altitude. Far below, the corridors hold their breath. Stone walls absorb what little warmth the day once offered, radiating a gentle chill into the darkness. Dust particles settle onto worn steps, invisible in the absence of light The archways frame pools of deeper shadow, one leading into the next in patient procession. Somewhere a draught finds its way through gaps in shutters, a soft exhalation that stirs nothing but itself. The monastery has become a vessel for stillness, every chamber and passage filled to the brim with quiet. The bell itself is a presence felt more than seen, a mass of bronze suspended in the darkness. Its surface holds the cold of the mountain night, smooth and unmoving. The faint patterns etched into the metal remain hidden, known only by memory and morning light. No vibration disturbs its rest. The clapper hangs centered and still, as motionless as the stone beneath it. Above, the wooden beams creak once, twice, settling under the weight of accumulated years. Time passes without measure, marked only by the slow wheel of stars beyond the tower openings. The night deepens toward its quietest hour. Cold air pools in the courtyard below, settling like water into every low place. The mountain wind has gentled to nothing more than a memory of movement. Silence wraps around stone and bronze and timber, a blanket woven from darkness and distance. The monastery rests, held safe between earth and sky, breathing softly through the hours until dawn. May the monastery's gentle silence follow you into sleep. If you found rest here tonight, please like and subscribe. New stories are published every week, each one a doorway to deeper calm. Good night.